Easter Sunday was weeks ago, but we are still celebrating the season of Easter, doing everything we can in these great 50 days to celebrate the resurrection of Jesus and appropriate all that it means to say, Christ is risen indeed. It means that death has been defeated. It means that life has won the day. It means that now, truly, all things are possible. So I'm not really sure why the lectionary committee chose our gospel reading for today. It's the one where Jesus says, I am the gate. And I think, really? The gate? Of all the passages you could have picked, you picked this one? Because if you wanted to use one of the I am sayings from the Gospel of John during the season of Easter, you could have used something a little more appropriate, like I am the bread of life, for example, or I am the resurrection and the life. I am the way, the truth, and the life. But I am the gate? A gate isn't very warm and friendly, is it? Not nearly as appealing an image as the one Jesus uses in the very next verse, I am the good shepherd. I like that. I can picture that Jesus going out to look for his lost sheep and putting them up on his shoulders when he finds them and bringing them back home rejoicing. I like that image. But a gate? A gate is so cold and impersonal, so mechanical. It swings on a hinge, and it carries the unavoidable implication that you might end up on the wrong side of it. I've had a little experience with that. In the spring of 1979, I dropped out of college for a semester to work on a sheep farm in West Virginia. I had been struggling in my pre-med studies at the time and was almost certain that I wasn't going to become a doctor. I was talking to my brother Ed about this. He was teaching school in Hillsboro, West Virginia, in the high mountains on the eastern part of the state. He said, there's a farmer in my church here who's injured his back and needs some help on the farm. Why don't you take a semester off and come work for him? And honestly, almost anything sounded better than another semester of organic chemistry. And so I said yes, and that's how I found myself on the McNeil farm in late January of 1979. I went to bed that first night and got up the next morning to the smell of frying bacon. Mac McNeil, the farmer, was down there cooking over a wood-burning stove. Fried eggs, bacon, a couple of cold biscuits he put on my plate. Eat up, he said, you're going to need it. And then he pointed to a hook on the wall where there was a spare pair of coveralls hanging, and underneath it a pair of muddy rubber boots. Put those on before you come out, he said. And I did. And a big heavy coat and a warm woolen cap and some thick gloves because it was cold outside, 12 degrees when I went out that first morning, and it didn't warm up much through that long first day. Organic chemistry began to look better and better. But I stuck to it. I had to. Mac had a lot of sheep, and most of them were ewes who were this close to lambing. We would let them out during the day, but at night we would pin them up in the big warm cellar that had been dug out under the barn. It was warm in there, but cold outside, so cold that a single sheep on its own might have frozen to death. It had happened before. And so we counted carefully when we brought them in out of the fields. Mac knew exactly how many sheep there were, and if even one of them was missing, he knew it. And one afternoon, one of them was missing, and he knew which one it was. An ornery sheep that used to push out under any high strand of barbed wire she could find to go off on her own. Old number 38, we called her. Mac and I shut the gate, got in the truck, and went looking for that sheep. It was getting dark, and he turned on the high beams as we roamed all around the edges of the property and finally caught up with her on the backside of the farm. Mac pinned her down in a corner with the headlights of the truck, and I got out and wrestled her to the ground and then heaved her up into the truck bed and rode with her all the way back to the barn. By the time we got back, I was shivering with the cold. We got her down, shoved her inside the pen, slammed the gate shut behind her, and it was right then that I understood how important that gate was and how important it was to be on the right side of it. If old number 38 had stayed out that bitterly cold night, we would have found her dead the next morning. I am the gate, Jesus says. Whoever enters by me will be saved. And it would be easy to leave it right there, thinking of the world outside the sheepfold as something cruel and dark and dangerous, and the world inside the fold as something warm and safe and comfortable. It would be easy for us to think that it's our job to get everybody out there in here, to go out on the front steps after worship this morning and say, "Hey, everybody, Jesus is the gate. Whoever wants to be saved better get in here." And then come back in to sing another chorus of when we all get to heaven. But it is just after Jesus says that He is the gate, that whoever enters by Him will be saved, that He says the ones who enter will come in and go out and find pasture. Because I don't think He's talking about eternal salvation, not yet. I don't think He's even talking about eternal life, not yet. He's talking about abundant life, the kind that is worth living. And apparently it involves some going out and not only coming in. The Good Shepherd leads us into a life and into a place that is warm and sheltered and intimate, where we can experience real Christian community. But then leads us out again into the wide open spaces where we can breathe deeply and find our purpose and carry out our mission. It takes both to live the abundant life, the coming in and the going out. I wasn't the good shepherd. I wasn't even a pretty good shepherd, but even I could see that there was a difference between bringing the sheep in on a cold winter night and letting them out on a warm spring day to live the life God had given. Maybe it's only because it's Mother's Day, but that reminds me of a story. I was 13 years old, and I had read a book called The Walkabout, a story of an Aboriginal boy about my age who had spent several weeks on his own in the Australian outback in a kind of coming-of-age ritual. I admired the way he lived off the land in those days. I admired his independence and self-sufficiency. And because I was a Boy Scout, I thought I could do it too. So one afternoon in the early fall of that year, I made a loincloth for myself out of a long, wide strip of fabric. I wrapped it around my waist and secured it with a leather belt, and then, because the boy in the story had painted his face with Aboriginal markings, I borrowed a tube of my mother's red lipstick and drew big red circles around my eyes. When I was finished, I came downstairs and stood at the kitchen door waiting for my mother to notice. She was chopping vegetables for the evening meal, a big hearty stew she was making, chopping potatoes and carrots and celery and cutting up the beef to throw into the pot. She finally looked my way and saw me standing there in my loincloth, circles around my eyes. To her credit, she showed no surprise. "Going somewhere?" she asked. "Yes," I answered, "I'm going on my walkabout." going to spend the night in the woods and live off the land. So no matter what I do, no matter how hard I knock, do not let me in through that door." "All right," she said. "Have a good time." And with that, I was off, out the door and up the path toward the woods, past our neighbor's house where I stopped long enough to steal a couple of gourds left over from their summer garden. I don't know what they would have thought if they looked out the window and saw a young Aborigine in a loincloth, red circles around his eyes, stealing gourds left over from their garden. But they didn't see, or if they did see, they didn't say anything. I took the gourds and moved on up the path in my bare feet. I made my way up that trail that led to the top of the mountain. Had to watch out for the briars that wanted to scratch at my bare legs. Had to step over old strands of barbed wire from long-gone fences. There was one part of the mountain that was covered in stinging nettles, a waist-high weed with sharp, stinging spines on the underside of its leaves. And if you are walking through it, wearing only a loincloth, there is almost no way to avoid getting stung by the nettle. But if you are a Boy Scout and know that the jewel weed growing nearby can be used by popping open its fat joints and smearing the juice on the stings to provide instant healing, you will be all right. And I was. I made my way up the mountain and got to the top just in time to see the sun setting behind the hills. I didn't have much daylight left. I found a big flat rock that was covered in thick, spongy moss. I lay down on it just long enough to know that this was where I would spend that night. And then I piled up a heap of dry leaves, thinking that I would use them to cover myself and provide some insulation as the night got colder. And then I climbed up to the highest point on that mountain with my gourd in hand. And I broke it open as the sun was setting, that golden light shining on my face as I scooped out a handful of pulpy flesh from the gourd and stuck it in my mouth, feeling like a real Aborigine. But the pulpy flesh of a gourd tastes awful. And I spit it out as soon as I put it in my mouth, thinking, never mind. I wasn't quite that hungry. But I did begin to think about that big pot of stew simmering on the stove back home. How good it would be to sit down with my family and eat it. But almost instantly, I cleared that thought from my mind. I had told my mother that I would be out all night, and that's just what I intended to do. And so, because it was getting dark, I bedded down for the night. That moss was surprisingly comfortable. And the rock under it was so smooth and flat, I felt like I was in my own bed at home. I piled those dry leaves up on top of me and lay there feeling warm and satisfied. I closed my eyes and waited to drift off to sleep as the moon began to slide up over the horizon. That's when I felt the first bite. It was a hard, fiery bite, like someone had poked me with a burning stick. And then there was another, and then another, and I learned that that moss was not only a comfortable bed, but apparently home to 1,000,000 small biting bugs. And all they needed was the smell of my warm, unprotected flesh to cause them to rise up through the moss and into a feeding frenzy that was going on even as I leaped up from my bed and tried to swipe the bugs off my back and my legs. It was too late. I must have been bitten 100 times. So I stood there in the moonlight, wondering what to do next. I couldn't really lie back down. Those bites were itching like crazy. And then I thought of the soothing black mud on the riverbank. That would feel so good to smear it on those bites, to feel its healing powers. And so I left behind that spongy bed of moss, that pile of brown, dry leaves. I left behind that half-eaten gourd on the mountaintop and began to make my way back down the path, through the field of stinging nettles, through the sharp, scratching briars, tripping over broken-down barbed wire fences, bruising my feet on the sharp stones, making my way toward the soothing black mud of the riverbank. When I got there, I was itching and aching from head to toe, and I scooped up handfuls of the stuff and smeared it on my arms, my legs, my wrist, my ankles, my face. I sat down in the mud and covered myself completely with it. And there I was. That's a picture for you, isn't it? The mud man of West Virginia, little Jimmy, the Aborigine, ready to be done with his walkabout. I sat there for a while and sighed, started thinking about home, about my family gathered around the table, that big pot of stew right in the middle, hot homemade bread fresh out of the oven, everybody talking and laughing, the light streaming through those windows into the outer darkness. I could picture it all. I wanted to go home. But I had told my mother I would be out all night and not to let me in, no matter what. I had meant it. And I thought, well, I could go sleep in the barn, in the feed room. Maybe I could climb into the back of the car if nobody locked it. But I didn't want to do either of those things. I just wanted to go home. I was achy and itchy and cold. Finally, I waded out into the water and washed off all the mud and then started back up the hill on my bruised feet, bent over with fatigue. I climbed the path that led up to our house and stood there in the backyard for a minute. It looked as if supper had been over for a while. The dining room table had been cleared. My mother was in the kitchen washing dishes. I swallowed hard and climbed the back steps and then knocked on the door and waited to see what would happen. "Who is it?" my mother asked. "It's me," I said. I was outside that door, a little lost lamb, knowing that everything depended on the woman who stood on the other side, my mother. Would she let me in? Or would she do what I had told her to do and keep me out? I hugged myself for warmth and waited for what seemed like an eternity. And then the door swung open, and the light and the warmth came pouring out, and the smell of fresh baked bread and homemade stew came rushing out to greet me, and there stood my mother in the kitchen light, wearing her apron and looking at me. A shivering, skinny, bug-bitten boy in a loincloth with a little bit of mud still smeared behind one ear. "Would you care for some supper?" she said. Yes, I would," I said, "but I told you not to let me in." "Ah, that's all right," she said. "I think we have enough stew for one more." And then she reached out and pulled me in to her embrace and wrapped her arms around me, and I could feel the love around me and filling me up and spilling over in tears. I stayed right there for a long time. And finally, she gave me a gentle push down the hall toward the bathroom where I could get washed up and put on some clean, dry clothes. And when I finished, I came back out and found the table set and a steaming bowl of stew waiting for me and a thick slice of buttered bread and a tall glass of milk filled to the top and almost overflowing, and my mother sitting right there waiting for me. I don't think anything ever tasted as good as that stew on that night. Nothing had ever sounded better than my mother saying to me, "Welcome home." It wouldn't have sounded so good if I hadn't been out there, miserable and bug-bitten in the outer darkness. The door that had opened to let me in to a place of warmth and comfort had also opened to let me out to a place of adventure and discovery. And for me, at least, the abundant life requires both. I think Jesus knew that about me before I was born. I think His Heavenly Father has known that about His children all along. King David used to say that the Lord was his shepherd, the one who made him lie down in green pastures, who led him beside still waters, the one who led him in paths of righteousness, but also the one who walked with him when he was walking through the deepest, darkest valleys, the one who prepared a table before him in the presence of his enemies, who anointed his head with oil, who filled his cup to overflowing. This is the kind of God who will open the door for you when you've come to the end of your resources, who will invite you to come in and sit down and sup with Him, but also the kind who will open the door to let you go out again. Because it's not just safety and security He wants for us. It's life, abundant, overflowing, and everlasting. Amen.